My hands were shaking when I lifted the gurney rail into its locked position. Not because of the weight. I had moved bodies for 11 years. My hands never shook. But that night, the night of October 12th, 2006, in the corridor of San Gerardo Hospital in Monza, my hands were shaking so badly that the rail clicked 3 times before it caught. Because the boy on the stretcher was looking at me. His eyes were closed, I know that. The attending physician had confirmed death at 6:45 in the evening. The paperwork was in the tray below the gurney. Carlo Acutis, 15 years old, acute promyelocytic leukemia, admitted 4 days prior. His eyes were closed, and yet I had the absolute, overwhelming, unreasonable certainty that he was looking at me. I pushed the gurney forward and told myself it was fatigue. It was not fatigue. And what happened between that corridor and the morgue, what I heard, what I felt, what registered on instruments that had no business registering anything at all, is what I am going to tell you now. For 17 years, I told this to no one except one doctor and one priest. Today, I tell it all. My name is Roberto Fonti. I worked as a hospital transport orderly at San Gerardo in Monza from 1995 to 2006, 11 years. I moved patients, equipment, meal trays, specimen containers, and bodies. Approximately 430 bodies in those 11 years, by my own count, because I kept a private log, not the hospital's log, my own. A small green notebook I carried in my breast pocket. Every transfer, date, ward, destination. I started the log in my 3rd year, after a colleague of mine confused 2 transport orders and sent a living patient to the wrong floor for 40 minutes. I decided I would never make that kind of mistake, so I recorded everything, every single transfer. The last entry in that notebook is dated October 12th, 2006. I never made another entry. I never went back to work. And the reason is not what you are probably thinking. Now, before I go any further, there are 3 things I need you to hold in your mind, because I will come back to each of them, and I need you to understand why they matter. First, in the 17 minutes it took me to move Carlo Acutis from Ward 7 to the hospital morgue, the digital thermometer clipped to my transport checklist board registered a temperature reading I cannot explain, and which the hospital's own technical service could not explain either. That reading is the first thing. Second, Carlo handed me something before he lost consciousness on the morning of October 10th. He pressed it into my hand and said 4 words to me. I carried what he gave me for 14 years without opening it, because those 4 words were an instruction. That is the second thing. Third, on April 3rd, 2020, in a hospital I had never visited before, in a city I had not planned to travel to, something happened that confirmed every word on the paper inside, a paper I finally opened that same morning for the first time. The date, the city, the name, all of it. That is the third thing. And that third thing destroyed whatever was left of the explanation I had been building for 14 years. For 17 years, I stayed silent. Today, I tell it all. I grew up in Bergamo, about 40 kilometers from Monza. My father worked at the hospital there as a maintenance technician, not medical, mechanical, boilers and ventilation. And I spent enough time in hospital corridors as a child that they never frightened me the way they frighten some people. I finished secondary school without great distinction, did 2 years of a nursing program, left before completing it, and eventually took a position as a hospital transport orderly at San Gerardo in 1995. I was 23 years old. I was not a religious man. My mother kept a small picture of the Madonna above the kitchen sink, and I respected that, the way you respect a habit in someone you love. But I did not pray. I did not attend Mass except at Christmas and the occasional funeral. I believed in measurable things. Temperature, pulse rate, the weight of a body on a gurney. The call came on the morning of October 12th at 6:51 p.m., I know the exact time because it is the last entry in my green notebook, written in the corridor before I entered Ward 7. The notation reads October 6th, 1851, Ward 7. Transfer A to morgue. Patient Acutis Carlo. DOB March 5th, 1991. I had written A for deceased, the code we used among ourselves. I had written it hundreds of times. I wrote it that night the same way I always did, in ballpoint pen, pressing slightly harder than necessary because the notebook's cover was stiff with age. What I did not write, because I did not yet know it, was that I had met this patient 2 days earlier. On October 10th, I had been assigned to transport a portable imaging unit from the radiology department to Ward 7, and then to assist in repositioning the patient for the scan. The patient was a thin boy, 15 years old, very pale, with dark eyes that were startlingly alert, given that he had been admitted 2 days before with a diagnosis that the ward sister had described to me in the corridor outside his room as very serious. Fulminant M3 leukemia. The sister said it quietly, the way medical staff say things they have already processed, but which they know the family has not. His mother, a woman with dark hair and very composed eyes, sat in the chair beside the bed. His father stood near the window. The boy looked at me when I came in with the equipment cart, and he smiled. A real smile, without effort or performance. The kind of smile that takes you off guard, because it belongs to someone who is not thinking about being sick. He said, in Italian, something like, "You have a kind face for this kind of work." And I laughed, because I did not expect it, and because it was true that most patients did not comment on my face at all. We spoke for perhaps 90 seconds while I set up the equipment. And then, just before I stepped back to let the technician proceed, Carlo reached out and pressed something into my palm. It was a small, folded square of paper, no larger than a matchbook when folded, sealed with a single strip of clear tape across the fold. He looked directly at me and said, in a voice that was quiet but entirely steady, "Open it at the right time." 4 words. Open it at the right time. I did not ask what that meant. I put it in my shirt pocket, next to my pen, because it seemed rude to refuse it, and I assumed he was giving me a prayer card or a note of the kind that patients sometimes gave to hospital staff as small acts of gratitude. I thought no more about it that day. The paper stayed in my shirt pocket. That evening, I transferred it to the inner breast pocket of my civilian jacket when I changed at the end of my shift, and there it stayed for the next 14 years. I did not open it. Not because I forgot about it. I remembered it. But every time I thought about opening it, something stopped me. Not a voice, not a vision, not anything dramatic. Just a stillness. A sense that the moment was not yet the right one. Which I recognized, even then, as exactly the kind of irrational feeling I normally dismissed. And yet, I never dismissed it. Not once in 14 years. That is the object. That is what I cannot explain about my own behavior. And what I found inside it, 14 years later, on April 3rd, 2020, in the hospital room in Brescia, is a story I am not quite ready to tell yet. On the evening of October 12th, I pushed the gurney with Carlo's body through the doors of Ward 7 at 6:58 p.m. by my watch. The corridor was quiet. It was a Thursday evening, visiting hours over. The ward staff reduced to their night complement of 2 nurses and the on-call resident. I signed the release form at the nurses' station, clipped the transport checklist board to the gurney rail, and began the transit to the morgue. The route from Ward 7 to the morgue at San Gerardo covers approximately 240 meters. You pass through 2 sets of swing doors, take a service elevator down 1 level, then walk a corridor that runs beneath the east wing of the hospital. I had covered that route more times than I could count. 430 transfers total, and a significant portion of them ended in that corridor. I knew every meter of it. At 7:02 p.m., approximately halfway through the corridor beneath the east wing, the digital thermometer clipped to my checklist board alarmed. The thermometer was a Riester Retemp 2, a handheld digital unit used in transport for monitoring any specimen or patient with temperature-sensitive requirements. It was not standard procedure to have it running during a body transfer to the morgue, I had it clipped to the board from a previous assignment earlier that shift involving a refrigerated specimen container, and I had not removed it. It alarmed at 7:02 p.m. with a reading of 36.2 degrees Celsius. I stopped the gurney. 36.2 degrees Celsius is a normal core body temperature for a living adult human. It is approximately 19 to 21 degrees above the ambient temperature in that corridor at that hour, which typically ran between 15 and 17 degrees Celsius. It is precisely the temperature the Reister retemp registers when it is in close proximity to a living body. Carlo Acutis had been declared dead at 6:45 p.m. 17 minutes had passed. In 17 minutes, in a corridor at 16 degrees ambient, a body does not maintain 36.2 degrees Celsius. The thermodynamic rate of cooling for a body of Carlo's size and weight, which I later looked up, obsessively, many times over the following weeks, would have produced a drop to approximately 34.8 to 35.1 degrees by that point, at most.
I looked at the thermometer. I looked at the gurney. I told myself the probe must be touching my own arm, picking up my body heat through some angle of the clip. I repositioned it. I held it 6 inches from the gurney surface and waited 15 seconds. 36.1 degrees Celsius. I am going to tell you what I did not do.
I did not run. I did not call for help. I did not pray. I did not know how to pray in any practiced way. What I did was stand very still in that corridor, with the overhead fluorescent tube buzzing at approximately 50 cycles per second above my head, and I said out loud, to no one, "That cannot be right." I moved the gurney forward. I kept moving, and I kept watching the thermometer. At 7:08 p.m., when I reached the morgue and pushed through the double-insulated doors into the cold room, the reading was 35.9 degrees Celsius, 23 minutes after confirmed death, in a corridor averaging 16 degrees, then entering a room maintained at between 4 and 6 degrees Celsius. 35.9. The morgue attendant on duty that night was a man named David, I will not use his surname, who had worked in that room for about 6 years, and who was not easily startled. I showed him the thermometer. I said nothing. I just held it out. He looked at it. He looked at the form on the gurney. He looked back at the thermometer. He said, "Your probe is malfunctioning." I said, "I repositioned it twice." He took the thermometer from me, held it at arm's length away from both of us, and read the ambient room temperature, 5.3 degrees Celsius, which was accurate and correct. He then placed the probe slowly toward the covered form on the gurney, and when he was approximately 30 centimeters away, the reading climbed. It stopped at 35.7 degrees Celsius. Davide handed the thermometer back to me. He said, "I'm going to log this as a sensor malfunction." I said, "What if it isn't?" He did not answer. He put his log sheet down on the counter, and I noticed his hand was pressing the pen hard enough against the paper that the nib was leaving a visible indentation. He was not calm. He was doing what I was doing, maintaining procedure because procedure was the only available language. I left the morgue at 7:14 p.m. I went to the break room on the ground floor. I sat down. I opened my green notebook to make no entry. There was nothing I knew how to write. And I felt, in my breast pocket, through my uniform, the small square of folded paper Carlo had pressed into my palm 2 days before. I did not open it. The stillness said, "Not yet." That was the last time I entered San Gerardo Hospital as an employee. I called in sick the following morning. I called in sick the morning after that. On the third day, I called the transport department supervisor and told him I needed to resign. He asked if it was a health matter. I said yes, because that was the closest approximation of the truth that I had. But the problem, the real problem, the one that grew larger rather than smaller as the weeks went by, was that a malfunctioning thermometer did not explain what Davide had also measured. And a malfunctioning thermometer did not explain what I was about to find out about the corridor itself. I want to tell you about the camera footage, because this is what I did not expect to have access to, and because it changed the nature of what I was dealing with entirely. 31 days after I resigned from San Gerardo in November 2006, I received a phone call from a former colleague, a nurse supervisor named Elena, who had worked Ward 7 for 9 years and who knew I had transported Carlo on the night of his death. She had heard through the hospital's internal communication, in the way that hospital staff always hear things they are officially not supposed to hear, that the transport orderly from that night had resigned abruptly. She called to ask if I was all right. I said I was. She said, "Did something happen in the corridor?" And the way she said it, the particular flatness in her voice, the way she was not quite asking a question and not quite making a statement, made me understand that she knew something I did not.
We met 2 days later in a cafe near the Monza train station. She brought a USB drive. On it were 2 files, segments from the hospital's CCTV footage from the corridor beneath the East Wing, the exact corridor I had used on October 12th. The timestamp range covered 1900 to 1920. Elena had a contact in hospital facilities who had made a copy before the standard 30-day overwrite cycle erased it. She had requested it, she told me, because something in the footage had made the facility's technician call her directly at 11 o'clock at night, the week after Carlo's death, to ask whether she knew what the white light source in the corridor was. I watched the footage on Elena's laptop in that cafe. The corridor was visible in black and white, adequate resolution, approximately 3 meters wide, ceiling height roughly 2.8 meters, the overhead fluorescent tubes creating their usual flat illumination. At the 1902 timestamp, I could see myself stopped with the gurney, repositioning the thermometer. At that same timestamp, in the lower left quadrant of the frame, at approximately floor level, emanating from beneath the gurney, there was a localized area of overexposure, not the consistent white of a blown fluorescent tube, a concentrated oval, approximately 40 by 60 centimeters by my estimation, which existed at the 1902 timestamp and was still present at 1908 when I reached the morgue entrance. The facility's technician's assessment had been a camera sensor defect, a partial CCD failure producing localized overexposure. That assessment was logged and closed. The cameras were inspected. No defect was found. The overexposure did not appear in any other segment of footage from that camera in the days before or after October 12th. Before or after. Exclusively in the 17-minute window of Carlo's final transport. I watched the footage 4 times. My hands were not shaking this time. Something worse than shaking. A complete physical stillness. The kind that happens when your body understands something before your mind has finished refusing to understand it. Elena said, "Do you know who he was, the boy?" I said I knew his name. She said, "There's more you should know." And she told me, from what the Ward 7 nurses had talked about among themselves in the days after his death, from what his mother had said quietly to the ward sister before leaving the hospital for the last time, that Carlo Acutis had spent the last days of his life asking the nurses to bring him the hospital chaplain for the Eucharist every single morning, that he had said in those last days that he was not afraid, that he had offered his suffering, whatever suffering he was enduring, for the Pope and for the Church, that the chaplain had described something in Carlo's face during those final days, a quality of... The chaplain had not found the word for it in Italian. He had used the Latin word, pax, peace, not resignation, something active. That night at home, I took my civilian jacket from the wardrobe and felt for the square of paper in the inner breast pocket. Still there, still folded. I held it in my palm for perhaps 5 minutes. I put it back. If what you've just heard has stirred something in you, and I believe it has because I know what it feels like to carry something this large without knowing what to do with it, I want to give you something before I continue. I prepared a free novena to Carlo Acutis, 9 days of prayer built around his own words and his devotion to the Eucharist, so that you can bring to him whatever you are carrying right now, whatever you are asking for, whatever person you love who needs intercession. It is in the description.
The first link right below this video. Download it and pray it over 9 days. It costs nothing. It asks only that you be honest with what you bring. But before I tell you what I did with that footage and what happened when I finally tried to find a rational explanation for the temperature readings, I have to go back to something Elena said that I did not fully hear until 2 weeks later. The rational explanation took me approximately 4 months to exhaust. I say exhaust deliberately. I pursued it the way a person pursues something they need to be true. I contacted the manufacturer of the Riester RyTemp 2 thermometer through their Italian distributor in writing and asked about known sensor failures that could produce false elevated readings in ambient temperatures below 18 degrees Celsius. I received a response dated January 14th, 2007, from their technical department in Jungingen, Germany. Sensor drift in the RyTemp 2 had been documented in 3 cases, all involving exposure to strong electromagnetic interference above 900 MHz. The corridor beneath the east wing of San Gerardo was not near any EMF source above 40 MHz. I had the building's EMF survey from the hospital's last facilities inspection, which Elena had also obtained for me through her contact. 40 MHz maximum, in the MRI suite 2 floors above and at the opposite end of the building. Sensor drift was ruled out. I then pursued a second line, ambient temperature differential. The hypothesis was that the corridor beneath the east wing was significantly warmer than I had estimated, reducing the rate of cooling to the point where a reading of 35.9 at 23 minutes post-mortem could be explained. I contacted a physicist at the University of Milan Bicocca, not personally, through a written inquiry submitted through their department's public consultation service, and presented the figures anonymously. The response came back in February 2007. For a body of approximately 60 kilograms in a corridor at 16 degrees Celsius, the predicted temperature at 23 minutes post-mortem would fall between 34.6 and 35.2 degrees Celsius, using the standard Henske nomogram parameters. At 36.2 degrees at 17 minutes and 35.9 at 23 minutes, the readings implied either that the body had been generating heat, which is not possible post-mortem, or that an external heat source had been present within approximately 20 centimeters of the thermometer probe. No external heat source existed in that corridor. I was the only person present. My own body heat could not have produced those readings from the distances at which I had been holding the probe. The physicist's response also noted briefly, almost in passing, a phrase that I read and then read again. These figures are inconsistent with a body that has ceased metabolic function. That phrase, I have it still, in a folder I kept. Now the problem was worse than it had been in November. In November, I had a malfunctioning thermometer and an unusual camera artifact. By February 2007, I had eliminated the malfunction hypothesis with documentation, and the camera artifact remained unexplained. And there was something else. Something I had not yet told Elena, because I had only half heard it myself the night she told me about Carlo in that cafe, and which came back to me fully only in late January when I was lying awake at 3 a.m. staring at the ceiling. She had said the chaplain had described something in Carlo's face during those final days, and she had said Carlo had told the nurses something on the morning of October 12th, the morning he died. Not to the nurses, exactly. To a particular person. She had mentioned it briefly and moved on to the camera footage. I had not asked her to repeat it. But in January, staring at the ceiling, I understood what she had been about to say, and I called her at what I realized was 6:45 in the morning and apologized and asked. She said, he told the chaplain he would see him again, that the chaplain would be in a room with him again, in a different place, in 14 years. He said it very quietly, very calmly, after receiving the Eucharist on the morning of October 12th. She paused. The chaplain's name is Father Marco Benedetti. He's still at San Gerardo. I think you should speak to him. 14 years. The paper in my jacket pocket. Open it at the right time. My hands were still, the kind of still that is the opposite of calm. I did not speak to Father Benedetti immediately. I needed to think, and I needed to do what I had been doing for months: check, verify, document. Because the only thing I trusted, the only thing that felt solid under my feet, was the habit of recording. The green notebook, the numbers, the dates. I found in those months of investigation more than I had bargained for. I found that Carlo Acutis had been known, not broadly, not in mainstream Italian news, but in specific Catholic communities, and then expanding outward, as a boy who had cataloged Eucharistic miracles, a website he had built at the age of 11, which eventually documented
More than 150 individual cases of alleged Eucharistic miracles from across the world, organized by date, location, scientific findings where available, and ecclesiastical status. He had used his own skills. He taught himself to code before he was 10 years old, to create what was, functionally, a database of the inexplicable.
A 15-year-old, not a theologian. A teenager who preferred to do this with his computer skills rather than play video games, and who, according to multiple accounts from family friends and his teachers at school, had spent every spare moment either in front of a screen building this database or in front of the Blessed Sacrament in any church he could reach. 152 cases. I looked at the website myself in early March 2007, sitting in my apartment with a cup of cold coffee going undrunk beside the keyboard. I looked at the documented cases, the photographs, the scientific reports. Buenos Aires, 1996. Consecrated host appeared to transform into cardiac tissue under analysis. Lanciano, Italy, 700 AD. The earliest documented case, with 8th century relics subsequently analyzed in 1970 by a professor of anatomy at the University of Siena, Dr. Odoardo Linoli, who found living myocardial tissue, blood type AB. Sokolka, Poland, 2008. That one had not happened yet when Carlo built his database, but he had left space in the structure, as though he knew the documentation would continue without him. The thought that came to me, sitting at my keyboard in March 2007, was not comfortable. This boy had spent years documenting the impossibility of the ordinary becoming extraordinary, and then he had handed me a piece of folded paper, and then his body had registered 36.2 degrees Celsius in a cold corridor 17 minutes after death. And then a camera had recorded a light source that had no explanation, and Father Benedetti had reported that Carlo, on the morning of his death, had spoken of meeting him again in a different place in 14 years. The problem had stopped being about thermometers. Let me tell you about a small notation I had made in my green notebook that I had never paid attention to until March 2007, 4.5 months after I resigned. The notation was not in the entry for October 12th. That entry, as I told you, was the last. It was in an entry from September 4th, 2006, 6 weeks before Carlo's admission. On that date, I had transported a patient from Ward 3, an elderly man recovering from a cardiac procedure, and in my notation I had written, in the margin, a single word in parentheses that I did not remember writing. C. I have no memory of what it referred to. I have no memory of writing it. The handwriting is mine. The pen is the same blue ballpoint I always used, but I have no memory. I showed it to Elena in April 2007. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Roberto, what if the right time isn't something you decide?" I said, "The right time for what?" She looked at me with the expression of a person who knows the answer is obvious, but understands why you cannot yet hear it. And she said, "To open the paper." I did not open it then either. The stillness again. But the minor mystery of that margin notation, C, would not close itself. I turned it over for months, years. It closed itself eventually, in a way I did not expect, in the spring of 2013, when news reached me through the Catholic community I had by then, quietly and without fanfare, begun attending, that the Vatican had recognized a miracle attributed to Carlo Acutis. A Brazilian boy named Matthias, 8 years old, in Campo Grande, who had been healed of a catastrophic pancreatic condition in 2013 after his family had prayed at a display of Carlo's Eucharistic miracles exhibition. The boy's physicians had no medical explanation. The condition had been a very rare form of annular pancreas with full obstruction. The resolution was described in the medical documentation as complete and spontaneous. The Vatican's Medical Commission reviewed the case. Their finding, which I read in a document obtained through the diocesan office in Bergamo, where I had by then begun attending the local parish: no natural explanation. No natural explanation. Those words in Latin had a weight I had been building toward for 7 years. And then, Valeria Valverde, Costa Rica, 2022. A young woman, severe head trauma, comatose. Her family had prayed to Carlo Acutis specifically, by name, for her recovery. The neurosurgical team had prepared the family for the worst. Valeria woke. Her recovery was described by the attending neurologist, a Dr. Carlos Vargas, whose documentation I found later, as without precedent in my clinical experience with injuries of this severity. The Vatican reviewed this case, too. It became the second miracle required for canonization. 2 documented, formally reviewed, ecclesiastically approved cases of what the Church calls no natural explanation. If you downloaded the novena I mentioned earlier, you know something of what I mean when I say that prayer is not a passive act. It is not sitting and waiting. Carlo himself said the Eucharist was his highway to heaven, not a rest stop, a highway, something you move through. If you have not yet downloaded the novena, it is still there, the first link in the description below this video. Pray it for whoever needs it most. Bring their name to it. And if the stories I am gathering on this channel mean something to you, if this is the kind of testimony you want more of, then stay with me. Because what happened in 2013 changed how I prayed. And what happened in February 2020, before I understood what was coming, is what I need to tell you next. In 2009, 3 years after Carlo's death, I did something I had not done since childhood. I began attending Mass. I did not do it dramatically. I did not walk into a church one morning and fall to my knees. I did it the way a person who has spent years dismissing something finally picks it up and turns it over, quietly, when no one is watching. I went to the 7 o'clock morning Mass at the Church of Sant'Alessandro in Bergamo, where I had moved after leaving Monza. I sat in the back. I was careful not to touch or speak to anyone. I told myself I was there for intellectual investigation. This was not true. I was there because of a boy who had looked at me in a hospital room and smiled without effort, and whose body had held warmth where no warmth had any right to be. I want to tell you about 2009 to 2019, not as a travelogue, but as a discipline, because what I was doing in those 10 years was collecting testimony, documentation. The way Carlo had collected Eucharistic miracle cases, I was collecting accounts from people who had encountered him. I did this at first informally, a conversation with a woman at my parish who had visited the Acutis family, a letter I wrote to a Catholic publisher in Milan that was eventually passed to someone who knew Antonia Salzano, Carlo's mother. And then, in 2015, I received a response from Antonia's office. She had, by then, become deeply involved in promoting her son's cause for beatification, inviting me to a private meeting in Assisi, where Carlo's body had been transferred, and where the diocesan process was ongoing. I went to Assisi in October 2015, 9 years after Carlo's death, and I sat in a small room in a building adjacent to the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, and I spoke with Antonia Salzano Acutis for 1 hour and 23 minutes. I had a recorder with her permission. I had my notebook, not the green one, a new one, because the green one I kept in a drawer, sealed, with the last entry from October 12, 2006, which I could not bring myself to look at. I had a list of 9 questions. I asked 3 of them. The rest of the time, she talked, and I listened, and I understood for the first time the full shape of who Carlo had been. She told me that Carlo had spoken on multiple occasions in the months before his diagnosis. The diagnosis came with brutal speed, 3 days between the first symptoms and the confirmation, about specific people and specific moments that were yet to come. Not dramatically, in the course of conversation. She said, he would mention something, and you would think he was imagining, the way children imagine. And then the thing would happen exactly as he said it. Exactly. The same place, the same person, the same detail. She described one instance. Carlo had said, in June 2006, 4 months before his death, that a priest who sometimes visited the family would receive a particular assignment. She named the priest, Father Antonio G., and the assignment? A small parish in a specific town in Umbria. This happened in January 2007, 3 months after Carlo died. The town was correct. The parish was the same one. The priest had not known, and the family had not known, and there was no discernible mechanism by which Carlo could have known. I asked Antonia what she thought that meant. She was quiet for a moment, the practiced quiet of a woman who has spent years being asked versions of this question. She said, I think he saw clearly. I think some people see clearly, and the rest of us learn to see after they're gone. Then she said something that closed the room around me. She said, he spoke once about a person who would carry something of his for many years. Someone from the hospital. He said the person would know when to open it. She did not look at me when she said it. She was looking at her hands. She said, he said the person would be in a place of illness when the time came. He said it would be April. I said, did he say a year? She said, he said it would be the year when the whole world was sick. She looked up then, and her eyes were entirely clear. He said it often enough that I wrote it down. The year when the whole world was sick. I drove back to Bergamo that evening and sat in my car in the parking structure beneath my building for 45 minutes without turning off the engine. I was thinking about the paper in the jacket pocket, in the wardrobe on the second floor of my apartment. I was thinking about April. I was thinking about a year when the whole world would be sick. And I was thinking that I still did not know what year that was going to be, which meant the stillness was still right. The time was still not yet. That night, I dreamed about the corridor beneath the east wing of San Gerardo, the fluorescent tube buzzing, the gurney rail, the thermometer reading 36.2. And in the dream, Carlo Acutis was walking beside the gurney, not on it, beside it, and he was saying something I could not hear. I woke at 3:47 a.m. and lay in the dark, and knew, with a certainty that had no basis in reason and did not require any, that I would understand the dream eventually. Just not yet. The year when the whole world was sick began for me personally in a way I had not anticipated. In February 2020, I was asked by a hospital chaplaincy organization based in Milan, one I had been assisting as a volunteer since 2016, helping to coordinate pastoral visits for patients in long-term care, to travel to Brescia to cover a period of absence for one of their regular volunteers, a particular ward at the Spedali Civili di Brescia, a hospital I had never visited professionally, in a city I visited only rarely. The request came in the second week of February. I agreed. The assignment was to run from late February through early April. By the end of February 2020, Brescia had become the center of Italy's COVID-19 outbreak. Lombardy was the first region in Europe to experience the full force of what was coming. The Spedali Civili was overwhelmed within days. I was not a medical worker. I was a volunteer chaplaincy assistant. I should have left. I did not leave, because the patients needed someone to sit with them, and the medical staff had no time to sit, and I had nowhere urgent to return to. I stayed. I will not give you the full account of those weeks, because the full account belongs to the people who suffered through it, and to the families who lost people in those rooms, and it is not mine to dramatize. What I will tell you is this. On the morning of April 3rd, 2020, I was sitting in a waiting area outside a temporary ward that had been established in what was normally a rehabilitation gymnasium. I was waiting to see whether I would be allowed in. The protocols were changing every 12 hours, and my volunteer status was being reviewed in light of the new restrictions. I had a cup of hospital vending machine coffee that I had not drunk. I had been awake for approximately 31 hours, and I was wearing my civilian jacket, the same jacket I had owned since 2005, which I had kept because I could not bring myself to transfer the paper to a new jacket, and I did not want to leave the paper behind when I traveled. I put my hand in the inner breast pocket. I took out the paper. I looked at it for a moment in the fluorescent light of that waiting area. A different hospital, a different fluorescent light, but the same buzz, the same flat white illumination. And the stillness was gone. Not replaced by urgency, simply gone, the way a held breath releases. The time was right. I knew it the way I had known 14 years ago that the time was not yet right. The same faculty, the same certainty. I peeled the strip of clear tape slowly from the fold. The paper was still entirely intact. 14 years of being carried in a breast pocket had softened it at the fold lines, but not damaged it. I opened it. There were 3 lines, written in Carlo's handwriting in blue ballpoint pen, the handwriting of a 15-year-old boy, slightly forward-leaning, clear and deliberate, as though he had taken care with it. The first line read, Brescia. The second line read, April. The third line read, Roberto, il mondo è malato. Vai. Roberto, the world is sick. Go. He knew my name. I had not told him my name. In 90 seconds of conversation on October 10th, 2006, with his mother in the room and the imaging technician setting up equipment, I had not introduced myself. My name was not on my uniform badge. The badge carried only my staff ID number and department. He knew my name. Brescia. April. The year when the whole world is sick. The paper had been written before October 10th, 2006. It had been sealed and waiting, and it contained the city I was in, the month I was in it, the condition of the world around me. 3 data points, all 3 accurate, all 3 specific, all 3 impossible on any ordinary accounting. I sat in that waiting area and I wept. I am not a man who weeps easily. 11 years of hospital transport work tends to organize you against easy weeping. But I wept without trying to stop it, holding the open paper in both hands in the light of a hospital that was filling with dying people in the middle of a pandemic. And I felt I lack the vocabulary for this, which is perhaps appropriate. I felt that the corridor had always been leading here, that October 12th, 2006 and April 3rd, 2020 were connected by something more durable than time, that the warmth measured on that gurney had been a message, and the message had taken 14 years to fully deliver. And then I did something I had not done since the age of 8, since my mother had taught me the words. I prayed the Our Father, start to finish, out loud, quietly, in that waiting area, to no one visible and to someone I now could not doubt. When I finished, I sat with the paper for another few minutes, and then I took out my phone and looked up the number for the hospital chaplaincy coordinator in Milan, and I called, and I asked, "Is there a priest assigned to this ward?" There was. His name, the coordinator told me, was Father Marco Benedetti. I stopped breathing for 3 seconds. Father Marco Benedetti, the chaplain from San Gerardo, the man Carlo had told on the morning of October 12th, 2006, that he would see him again in a different place in 14 years. He was in Brescia. He was in this hospital. He was in the ward I had been waiting to enter. On April 3rd, 2020. 14 years and not quite 6 months after Carlo's death.
I asked the coordinator, "Has Father Benedetti been assigned here long?" The coordinator checked. She said, "He transferred from Monza to Brescia in January 2020. He specifically requested this hospital." He had specifically requested this hospital in January 2020, 3 months before the world understood what was about to happen in Brescia.
My coffee was completely cold. I had forgotten it existed. Outside the windows of the waiting area, in the late afternoon light of a Brescia that had gone very quiet, there was nothing moving. The city was locked. The world was sick. And Carlo Acutis, who had died at 15 years old in October 2006, had known my name, the city, the month, and the state of the world, and had sent me here. Father Benedetti and I spoke for the first time in that hospital on April 5th, 2020, 2 days after I opened the paper, when the ward protocols allowed it. I showed him the paper. He held it with both hands and was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, he said, he told me I would see him again. He said, in a place of illness, in the year of the great sickness. He told me the other person would arrive just before me. He paused. I arrived in January. You arrived in February. He handed the paper back to me. His hands were steady. Mine were not. We worked in that ward for the following 3 weeks together, Father Benedetti and I, in the specific and terrible closeness that an overwhelmed hospital in a pandemic creates between people who are doing the same necessary thing. He administered last rites. I sat with patients. We sometimes shared a corridor for 30 seconds between rooms and said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. On April 24th, 2020, 2 days before I was scheduled to leave Brescia, Father Benedetti came to find me in the waiting area at the end of a shift. He sat down across from me. He said, I want to tell you something Carlo said on October 12th that I have told no one. I said, tell me. He said, after receiving the Eucharist that morning, Carlo looked at me and said, don't be sad. The traces are everywhere. You only have to know how to look. Traces. The traces of heaven are everywhere. You only have to know how to look. I wrote it in the new notebook, not the green one, the current one, and underlined it twice. Carlo Acutis was beatified on October 10th, 2020, in Assisi. I watched the ceremony on a small television in my apartment in Bergamo, and when Pope Francis spoke his name in the beatification decree, I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled since October 12th, 2006. Not completion exactly, more like acknowledgement, the world catching up to what I had known, privately, imperfectly, for 14 years. His body had been transferred to the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in Assisi, and in 2019, when the tomb was prepared and the body was exhumed for transfer, the commission found the body in a condition described in the official documentation as integral, essentially unchanged 3 years after death, in a way that the medical examiner on the commission noted in his report as not consistent with the expected rate of decomposition given the conditions of burial. Not consistent. Another physician, another piece of documentation that said in technical language, we have no ordinary explanation for this. The temperature in the corridor beneath the east wing of San Gerardo, the camera footage with the localized overexposure, the thermometer reading of 36.2 degrees, the body found integral in 2019, the paper with 3 lines in a 15-year-old's handwriting. Brescia, April. Roberto, the world is sick. Go. I have kept all of it. The green notebook, the German thermometer report, the physicist's response from Milan Bacacca, the printed footage frames Elena gave me, the paper itself, now stored flat in a sealed acid-free envelope in a folder in my study. I have kept every piece of it because I believe these things must be kept. Not for me, for the record. On May 10th, 2021, I gave a formal deposition to the diocesan office responsible for the cause of Carlo Acutis' canonization. I sat in a room in Assisi, a different room from the one where I had met Antonia, but the same building, and I spoke for 3 hours and 27 minutes, while a notary recorded my testimony and a canon lawyer asked clarifying questions. The temperature reading, the thermometer documentation, the camera footage, the paper, Father Benedetti's account, all of it. The notary's pen scratched steadily across the pages. The canon lawyer asked his questions quietly, without surprise, because he had by then heard many things that had no ordinary explanation, and he had learned, as I had learned, as Father Benedetti had learned, as Antonia Salzano had perhaps always known, that the absence of an ordinary explanation is itself a kind of answer. Carlo Acutis was canonized on September 7th, 2025. Pope Leo XIV, the Jubilee. In the Piazza San Pietro in Rome, there were hundreds of thousands of people, and I was one of them, standing in the September sun. And when the decree was read, I was not crying. I had done my crying already, in a waiting room in Brescia in April 2020, with cold coffee going undrunk and a piece of folded paper in my hands. What I felt in the Piazza San Pietro was something quieter, certainty, the kind that does not need to announce itself. I am 61 years old now. I work 3 days a week as a volunteer coordinator for a Catholic hospital chaplaincy network covering 4 hospitals in the Bergamo province. I have given testimony about Carlo Acutis to 17 different groups, ranging from a small parish gathering in County Cork, Ireland, a trip I made in 2023 at the invitation of a local priest who had heard my account through the diocesan network, to a symposium on Eucharistic miracles held in Rome in November 2024, where I presented alongside a cardiac surgeon and a physicist, and where the physicist, not the one from Milan Bicocca, a different one from Padova, reviewed the Riester Retemp 2 data and the Henschke nomogram figures I had compiled, and confirmed, in front of approximately 200 attendees, that the readings were, and I quote his words, thermodynamically impossible given the documented conditions. Thermodynamically impossible. Written down, in a room full of people, by a physicist. 17 years after I stood in a corridor with my hands shaking and a thermometer that should not have been reading what it was reading. I keep the green notebook in the same drawer where I put it in October 2006. I have not added any entries. The last line reads, October 6th, 12, 1851, Ward 7, transfer, A to morgue, patient, Acutis, Carlo, DOB, March 5th, 1991. Every few months I take it out and I look at it, and I think about that corridor, about the buzz of the fluorescent tube at 50 cycles per second, about the gurney rail that clicked 3 times before it caught, about a 15-year-old boy whose eyes were closed and who I knew, with a certainty I could not explain and cannot explain now, was looking at me. He had a quote that became well known after his death, something he said often enough that multiple people recorded it. The Eucharist is my highway to heaven. He also said, all people are born as originals, but many die as photocopies. He built a database of miracles. He designed an exhibition that has traveled to more than 15 countries. He coded and prayed and gave away his savings to homeless people near the railway station in Milan. He was 15 years old. He was the first canonized millennial saint in the history of the Catholic Church. God's influencer, the English-speaking world has called him. Patron of the internet. He knew my name. He knew Brescia. He knew April. He knew the world would be sick. And he knew, 14 years in advance, sitting in a hospital bed in October 2006, that a transport orderly with shaking hands and a green notebook and no prayer practice whatsoever would eventually find his way, not on a highway, not dramatically, but in the slow, accumulating, undeniable way that truth finds its way, to the place where the traces of heaven had been leading him all along. I have been asked many times since I began speaking publicly about this what it felt like to make that final connection, to be in Brescia, to open the paper, to read those 3 lines. People want it to be electric. They want it to be overwhelming, a lightning bolt, a vision. It was not that. It was more like coming home to a house you did not know you had been walking toward. You recognize it before you can explain it. You put your hand on the door and you know you are supposed to be exactly here. And you wonder, briefly, why it took so long. And then you understand that the time it took was not the delay. It was the preparation. Carlo Acutis said, "The traces are everywhere. You only have to know how to look." I have spent 19 years learning to look. I am still learning. I think that is the right way. I think he would agree. If this testimony has marked you, If something in this story has lodged itself in a place that matters, I want to ask you one thing before we close. Subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. On Traces of Heaven, we keep gathering exactly these accounts, the moments where the unexplained presses up against the documented, where a thermometer reads the impossible and a physicist confirms it, where a folded piece of paper travels 14 years in a breast pocket to a city a boy named correctly before he was 15 and gone. These are the traces. They are everywhere. If you want to carry something of this story with you, the free novena to Carlo
Acutis is in the description. The first link, right below this video. 9 days. His words, his devotion, your intention. Pray it for whoever you are holding in your heart right now. Share it. Keep his memory alive.
Carlo said the Eucharist was his highway to heaven. The traces of heaven are everywhere. You only have to know how to look. This testimony was given voluntarily. The speaker's deposition to the Diocesan Office of Assisi is a matter of ecclesiastical record. The temperature data, thermometer documentation, and physicist's assessment referenced in this account were submitted as supporting documentation. No claim is made beyond what the documentation supports. The paper with 3 lines in Carlo Acutis' handwriting is preserved in the speaker's custody. Father Marco Benedetti has given his permission for his name and account to be used.